They accused her of stealing, in front of everyone. What they didn't know was that she was the real artist behind the gallery's most powerful painting. Grace Williams stood frozen in the center of the Whitmore Gallery, her dark hands trembling against the stark white walls. The crowd of well-dressed patrons formed a silent circle, their champagne glasses catching the gallery's pristine lighting like tiny spotlights illuminating her shame. Her Navy janitor's uniform felt like a scarlet letter as whispers rippled through the room like poison spreading through water. The marble floors she had mopped thousands of times now felt like quicksand beneath her worn work shoes. Margaret Thornfield, draped in pearls and entitlement, stood with her manicured finger pointed directly at Grace's chest. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had never been questioned, never been doubted. The ceramic sculpture that had started this nightmare sat innocently on its pedestal, completely unharmed. Yet somehow Grace had become the villain in a story she never asked to be part of. Security guards approached with practiced authority, their footsteps echoing through the hushed space like a countdown to humiliation. The gallery director, Richard Whitmore himself, followed with the uncomfortable expression of a man caught between his moral compass and his financial obligations. His donors were watching, his reputation was on the line, and Grace, faithful, hard-working Grace, had become expendable in the face of social pressure. But Grace's story didn't begin with that moment of public disgrace. It began 47 years earlier in a cramped apartment in Detroit, where a young girl discovered magic in her grandmother's old paintbrushes. Grace had been raised by her grandmother, Mama Rose, who cleaned offices downtown and came home each night with stories of beautiful buildings filled with art that people paid millions to see. Grace's first canvas was a piece of cardboard from a discarded box. Her first paints were stolen moments with her grandmother's makeup and food coloring mixed with water. Even then, at age 7, she understood that art was a luxury she couldn't afford, but a necessity she couldn't live without. Mama Rose would find her granddaughter asleep at the kitchen table, surrounded by makeshift masterpieces, and would quietly hang them on the refrigerator like they belonged in a museum. Throughout her childhood, Grace collected discarded art supplies from school dumpsters, mixed her own paints from whatever she could find, and painted on everything from cardboard to the backs of old calendar pages. She taught herself color theory by studying how sunset light changed throughout the seasons. She learned composition by watching how shadows fell across buildings during her walks to school. For 40 years, Grace had worked service jobs, cleaning offices, restaurants, and finally the Whitmore Gallery. 7 years ago, when she first walked through those doors as the new night janitor, she felt like she was entering a cathedral. The gallery housed works by masters she had only seen in library books, paintings that represented everything she had ever dreamed of creating, but never dared to pursue professionally. Every night, after the last patron left and the security system was set, Grace would push her cleaning cart through corridors lined with masterpieces. She would study brushstrokes with the intensity of a graduate student, examine color palettes with the eye of a professional, and lose herself in the beauty that others took for granted during daylight hours. The gallery after hours became her private art school, where she learned from the greatest teachers in history without ever paying a tuition fee. What nobody knew was that Grace's small one-bedroom apartment had been transformed into a secret museum. Every wall was covered with her paintings, not amateur attempts at art, but sophisticated explorations of the human condition that would have impressed any gallery owner in the city. Her paintings told stories of people like her. People who worked with their hands, who served others, who remained invisible despite being essential to society's function. The piece she was most proud of was titled Unseen Hands. It depicted weathered hands reaching upward through darkness toward a distant light, with subtle background details revealing the tools of service. A mop, cleaning supplies, work gloves, and a small paintbrush hidden among them. The painting spoke to the invisible labor that kept the world functioning, the dreams that persisted despite circumstances, and the dignity that existed in all honest work. If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We are just a small channel trying to grow. And do not forget to comment where you're watching from. Thank you, and back to our video. Grace had spent 3 months perfecting this piece, working on it every night after her shift at the gallery. She would arrive home exhausted, her back aching from hours of mopping and dusting, but she would still pick up her brushes and lose herself in the process of creation. The painting became her meditation, her prayer, her way of processing the daily experience of being seen but not truly observed. When the Whitmore Gallery announced an anonymous art competition open to all artists, Grace felt her heart race with possibility. The rules were simple. Submissions would be judged blindly, identified only by the artist's initials. No names, no biographies, no preconceptions, just pure artistic merit. For the first time in her life, Grace could be evaluated solely on her talent, not her occupation, her race, or her social status. After weeks of deliberation, she carefully wrapped unseen hands in protective cloth, filled out the submission form with trembling fingers, and wrote only GW in the space reserved for artist identification. The night she dropped off her submission, Grace stood outside the gallery for 20 minutes, wrestling with fear and hope in equal measure. The weeks following her submission were torture. Grace continued her nightly cleaning routine, but now she was surrounded by the competition entries, including her own. She would find excuses to linger near unseen hands, studying it among the other submissions, wondering if anyone else could see what she had poured into every brushstroke. The night of the exhibition opening, Grace worked her usual shift, telling herself she was simply curious about the competition results. The gallery was more crowded than usual, filled with art collectors, critics, and society figures. Grace moved through the crowd like a ghost, invisible in her uniform, emptying trash bins while conversations about artistic merit swirled around her. While cleaning near the sculpture section, Grace was carefully maneuvering her cart when her elbow accidentally bumped against a small pedestal. The ceramic piece wobbled precariously, and Grace instinctively reached out to steady it, her quick reflexes preventing what could have been a devastating accident. Her touch was gentle, practiced, the careful movement of someone who had spent years handling fragile objects without ever breaking one. Margaret Thornfield witnessed the incident from across the room, but what she saw was filtered through the lens of her own prejudices. In her world, people like Grace were potential threats, not protectors. The possibility that Grace had just saved the sculpture from disaster never entered her mind. The accusation came swift and loud, designed to draw maximum attention. Margaret's voice carried across the room as she announced that she had witnessed the cleaning lady handling the artwork inappropriately, her tone suggesting that Grace's very presence near the art was somehow criminal. The implication was clear and cruel. She was suggesting that Grace, by virtue of her race and occupation, was inherently suspicious. In that moment, Grace learned a devastating truth about visibility. For 7 years, she had been invisible in this space, moving through the gallery like a benevolent spirit. But now, accused of theft, she was all anyone could see. The crowd's stares felt like physical weight, and their silence was deafening. Not one person spoke up in her defense, despite years of faithful service. The gallery director approached with obvious discomfort. Margaret Thornfield was a major donor, someone whose opinion carried weight in social circles that mattered to the gallery's success. Grace, despite her years of dedication, was replaceable in ways that Margaret was not. As Grace was escorted toward the exit, she caught glimpses of the competition entries she passed. There was her own painting, Unseen Hands, hanging among works by artists who had never been questioned, never been suspected, never been reduced to the color of their skin or the humility of their occupation. The irony was devastating. She was being forced to leave the very space where her art was being celebrated by people who couldn't see the artist standing right in front of them. Outside the gallery, Grace collapsed onto a cold bench, her body shaking with the adrenaline of humiliation and the crushing weight of injustice. The tears came without permission, streaming down her face as she processed what had just happened. The city lights blurred through her tears as Grace sat alone, wearing the uniform of honest work, but feeling like she was wearing a criminal's clothes. Jamie Chun had been watching the evening's events unfold with growing discomfort. As the gallery's assistant curator, he had worked closely with Grace for 2 years, and he had noticed things that others missed. He had seen how she looked at the paintings during her cleaning rounds, not with the casual glance of someone simply doing their job, but with the intense focus of someone who understood technique, composition, and artistic vision. Jamie had grown up in a family that valued art but struggled financially. His parents had worked multiple jobs to put him through art school, and he recognized the signs of someone who loved art but had been denied access to formal training. He had watched Grace's eyes when she thought no one was looking, had seen her pause before certain paintings with the reverence of someone who truly understood what they were seeing. When he found Grace outside the gallery, sitting on the bench with tears streaming down her face, Jamie felt a mixture of anger at the injustice she had suffered and excitement about the news he was about to share. He had been in the judging room when the decision was made, had witnessed the unanimous enthusiasm for a piece that had moved experienced art critics to tears. Jamie sat beside Grace on the cold bench and gently revealed the news that would change everything. The judges had spent hours deliberating, but one painting had captured their attention from the moment they saw it. Unseen Hands was not just technically proficient. It was emotionally devastating, socially relevant, and artistically groundbreaking. The piece forced viewers to confront their own assumptions about worth, dignity, and the value of human labor. Grace's heart raced as Jamie continued his explanation. The painting had generated more discussion among the judges than any piece in the competition's history. Art critics in attendance had already begun drafting reviews, calling it a masterpiece that would define the cultural conversation for years to come. Collectors were inquiring about purchasing the work, and museum curators were discussing acquisition possibilities. But most importantly, the judges were desperate to meet the mysterious artist identified only as GW. They wanted to understand the person behind such a powerful piece, to learn about the experiences that had informed such profound artistic vision. The gallery was planning a special ceremony to honor the winner, and the art world was buzzing with speculation about the identity of this remarkable new talent. With Jamie's encouragement, Grace found the courage to return to the gallery, not as a janitor, but as an artist. Her legs shook as she walked back through the doors she had been escorted out of less than an hour before. The same crowd that had watched her humiliation was now gathered around the competition display, their voices filled with excitement and admiration for the very work that Grace had created in the solitude of her small apartment. Grace moved through the gallery like she was walking through a dream. The space looked different now, not like a workplace, but like a stage where her story was about to unfold. The crowd was larger now, drawn by word of mouth about the extraordinary winning piece. Grace could hear fragments of conversation as she moved through the room, people discussing the technical mastery of Unseen Hands, the emotional depth of its message, and the mysterious identity of the artist who had created it. Grace positioned herself near the back of the crowd, her janitor's uniform making her blend into the background even as she prepared to step forward and claim her place in the spotlight. She watched as Richard Whitmore prepared to make the announcement that would change everything. His earlier discomfort had been replaced by obvious excitement. He knew he was about to preside over a moment that would be remembered in art history. The moment arrived with electric anticipation. When Whitmore announced that the artist GW was present and ready to be revealed, the crowd fell silent with anticipation. Grace stepped forward, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The collective gasp that rippled through the room was audible, followed by a silence so profound it seemed to stretch for eternity. She watched as recognition dawned on face after face. The same people who had witnessed her humiliation an hour earlier were now confronting the reality that they had been wrong about everything. Grace stood in the center of the room, no longer invisible, no longer silent. For the first time in her life, she was being seen not as a stereotype or an assumption, but as a complete human being with talents, dreams, and a voice that demanded to be heard. Grace's artist statement was read aloud, her words carrying new weight now that the audience knew their source. She had written about the experience of being invisible in plain sight, about serving others while remaining unseen, about having hands that create beauty but are only noticed when they're suspected of taking it away. The words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone present to confront their own biases and assumptions about worth, talent, and human dignity. The painting itself became the centerpiece of intense discussion. Art critics in attendance spoke about its technical mastery, noting the sophisticated use of light and shadow, the complex layering of meaning, and the powerful way it communicated universal truths about human experience. The piece forced viewers to see the humanity in those they typically overlooked, to recognize the dignity in all forms of honest work. Margaret Thornfield stood frozen in the crowd, her face cycling through emotions from disbelief to embarrassment to something that might have been the beginning of real shame. The woman she had accused of theft was not only innocent but was the very artist whose work had moved her to tears just minutes earlier. The irony was devastating and complete. Local news crews, drawn by reports of the dramatic story, began setting up cameras and requesting interviews. The narrative was irresistible. A janitor whose secret talent had been hiding in plain sight, creating art that spoke truth to power while cleaning up after those who considered themselves her betters. Margaret Thornfield approached Grace with obvious discomfort, her earlier confidence replaced by awkward uncertainty. The woman who had pointed her finger in accusation just hours earlier now struggled to find words that could bridge the gap between her assumptions and reality. Her apology, when it came, sounded hollow even to her own ears, a reflexive attempt to salvage social standing rather than genuine remorse for the harm she had caused. Grace's response was simple but profound, delivered with the quiet dignity that had sustained her through years of invisibility. She told Margaret that she didn't need to know who Grace was to treat her with basic human respect. She just needed to see her as a person worthy of dignity. The words carried the weight of experience, the wisdom of someone who had learned that true character reveals itself in how we treat those we perceive as having less power than ourselves. Richard Whitmore, recognizing both the artistic merit of Grace's work and the powerful story behind it, immediately offered her a solo exhibition. The gallery director who had asked her to leave just hours earlier was now eager to showcase her talent and associate his institution with her remarkable story. Art collectors who had been dismissive of the cleaning lady just hours before now competed to commission pieces from the newly revealed artist. Within days of the revelation, Grace's story had spread through social media and art publications like wildfire. The narrative was compelling on multiple levels. It was a story about hidden talent, about the power of art to transcend social boundaries, and about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to see the full humanity in everyone. Grace gave notice at her janitorial position not out of shame for the work she had done, but because she now had the opportunity to pursue her true calling full-time. She was careful to emphasize in interviews that there was no shame in honest work, that her years as a janitor had taught her valuable lessons about perseverance, dignity, and the beauty that could be found in serving others. The solo exhibition, titled Scene, opened 3 months later to unprecedented crowds and critical acclaim. Grace's paintings, which had lived in isolation for decades, now graced the walls of the same gallery where she had once been invisible. The exhibition featured 35 pieces spanning 20 years of her artistic development, showing the evolution of her style and the deepening of her social consciousness. Local children, many from backgrounds similar to Grace's, came to see the exhibition with their families and school groups. They met an artist who looked like them, who understood their struggles, and who proved that talent and dreams could flourish regardless of circumstances. Grace spent extra time with these young visitors, encouraging them to pursue their own artistic visions and reminding them that their voices mattered. Grace used her newfound platform to speak about the importance of seeing the full humanity in everyone, regardless of their job title or social status. She appeared on talk shows, gave interviews to art magazines, and spoke at conferences about the intersection of art and social justice. Her message was consistent. Talent exists everywhere, but opportunity and recognition are unevenly distributed. Grace established a scholarship fund for underprivileged artists, using proceeds from her art sales to provide supplies, training, and exhibition opportunities for young people who might otherwise never have their talents recognized. She began teaching art classes at community centers, sharing not just technical skills, but the deeper truth that art could be a powerful tool for social change and personal expression. 6 months after her revelation, Grace opened her own gallery in a converted warehouse space in the city's arts district. The gallery featured not just her own work, but also pieces by other artists who had been overlooked or marginalized by the traditional art world. She created a space where talent was the only credential that mattered, where artists could be judged solely on their vision and skill rather than their connections or social status. The gallery's opening was attended by many of the same people who had witnessed Grace's humiliation and triumph at the Whitmore Gallery. Margaret Thornfield was among the attendees, approaching Grace with what appeared to be genuine humility this time. She had spent months reflecting on her actions and their implications, and her apology seemed to come from a place of real understanding rather than social obligation. During one interview, conducted in her gallery surrounded by paintings that had once been hidden in her apartment, a journalist asked Grace why she had waited so long to share her extraordinary talent with the world. Grace's response became the defining quote of her story, reprinted in articles and shared on social media. Because sometimes, the world only listens after it sees your truth. The question touched on something deeper than just personal timing. It addressed the systemic barriers that prevent talented individuals from marginalized communities from accessing opportunities to share their gifts. Grace's answer acknowledged that the world had to be ready to see her, not just that she had to be ready to be seen. 2 years after her revelation, Grace was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony of a prestigious art school. She stood before hundreds of young artists and shared the lessons she had learned about persistence, dignity, and the power of art to change hearts and minds. In her speech, Grace reminded the graduates that art was not just about personal expression, but about building bridges between different communities and experiences. The irony of Grace's story wasn't lost on anyone who knew the details. She had been surrounded by art lovers for 7 years, yet none of them had recognized the artist among them. Her journey from invisible janitor to celebrated artist became a powerful reminder that worth and talent exist independent of recognition, that creativity flourishes in the most unexpected circumstances, and that society's failure to see someone doesn't diminish their value. Grace's hands, once suspected of taking, were now recognized for what they had always been. Hands that created beauty, inspired change, and revealed truth through art. The gallery that had once been her workplace became her artistic home, and the paintings that had once been her secret became her legacy. Grace Williams had always been an artist. It had just taken the world 47 years to see what had been there all along.